Welcome to the session where we will discuss embedding industry certifications in undergraduate degree programs, which we call Certification+Degree Pathways, or for short, C+D Pathways. This project is a partnership among 4 organizations: WorkCred, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, the University Professional and Continuing Education Association, and the Coalition of Urban Serving Institutions. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Lumina Foundation for their generous support of this project. Next slide. This project addresses the problem of there being insufficient opportunities for students to earn credentials with labor market value and build those credentials towards a degree. We specifically focused this program on 4-year degree institutions. Our proposed solution was to convene certification bodies and 4-year universities to explore how students could earn both an academic degree and a certification. Our hypothesis was that C+D pathways offer universities an affordable, scalable approach to align degree programs with current industry needs, and they offer students the analytical skills they need to be lifelong learners, which are obtained in the degree, as well as the technical skills to immediately contribute as professionals, which we believe could be found in the certification. C+D pathways meet learners' clear desire to pursue a degree along credentialing pathways that lead to good and livable wage jobs. The benefit is that these pathways are applicable to bachelor's degrees in any academic discipline with industry-relevant competencies. Before we get into more detail about the project and the outcomes, I want to share a few slides about the current state of credentialing. Today, U.S. credentialing system is complex and difficult to navigate. The last decade has seen enormous growth in the number and variety of labor market credentials, ranging from college degrees, certificates, industry certifications, occupational licenses, badges, micro-credentials, and many more. In fact, according to Credential Engine, there are more than 967,000 different in the United States, and more than 8,100 of those are industry-recognized certifications. As we see in this slide, let's take a closer look at the post-secondary education credentialing system, which involves numerous public and private organizations. This graphic highlights the relationships among organizations that interact to form this system. And while many believe we do not have a system, we would argue that there is a system, albeit a bit messy. For example, if you look at the federal government box, which is in brown, and follow the arrows, it shows that regulations are created through agencies such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. These regulations influence competencies that are taught by post-secondary education providers in areas such as food handling and construction safety. In another example, if you follow the Professional Trade Associations box, highlighted in purple, you will see that their function of creating the body of knowledge for a profession, they need to work with academic accreditors, state government systems, and even employers. So all of these boxes are interrelated, depending on the type of credential. Now that we've explored the credentialing system, let's look at the individual credentials. One of the areas that had a robust discussion in our convenings with universities and certification bodies was about the proliferation of terminology. What is the definition of a credential? From our perspective, we use the term credential as an umbrella term to denote many types of credentials, such as degrees, licenses, certifications, badges, and certificates. However, one of the most misused terms is to call a credential and a certificate the same and to use those terms interchangeably. A credential is not the same as a certification or a certificate. A certification and certificate are types of credentials. So what are the different characteristics of different types of credentials? I'm going to spend some time focusing on 2 of the 4 credentials that are highlighted on this slide, and that being the certificate and the certification. Let's begin with certificates. Certificates are generally associated with completion of training or educational courses and are good for life, meaning they carry no time limit or renewal requirements. Certificates also cannot be revoked for reasons of incompetence or unethical behavior. And when we think about how certificates are created, a process frequently known as a DACM is used to identify the tasks, knowledge, and skills required for the certificate when developing the training or course. And that's used as a way to validate the content. Assessment tools are used in certificate programs to measure whether learning outcomes have been achieved. The assessment may be administered in multiple ways. You could have one assessment at the end of a course. You could have multiple assessments throughout the courses, and there are different types of assessments that could be used. The assessments could be written, oral, or performance-based. The certificate content and learning strategies and the assessments must all be in alignment. And while a certificate has no time limit, it is possible for a certificate issuer to include a estimated period of validity for the certificate. This is especially relevant in areas where technology is changing rapidly, such as in cybersecurity. For example, an organization that issues a cybersecurity certificate may decide that the knowledge learned is only valid for 2 years. An individual would then need to obtain a new certificate after 2 years in order to signal to employers that he or she has current knowledge. So now we've seen that certificates are really focused on education and training. We also see in this slide another type of credential, and that's the certification. Certifications, unlike certificates, are attestations of their holder's ability to perform a set of skills relevant to a professional setting. They are awarded and tracked by certification issuers, and certification issuers can cover a wide variety of organizations, including nonprofit organizations, professional associations, industry or trade organizations, or even employers. High quality certifications consist of 3 basic components. The first is that certifications are based on a third-party assessment. This oral, written, or performance-based assessment is based on a set of competency standards set through a defensible, industry, or profession-wide job task analysis process, which is revised on a regular basis. In many cases, certifications revise their knowledge base every 3 to 5 years, although that increases if you're in fields such as IT or cybersecurity. The second element for certifications is that they are time limited and renewable. That means an individual who earns a certification is required to recertify in order to retain the credential holder's certification and demonstrate that the knowledge and skills are current and reflect changing needs within an industry and occupational area. The third element is revocation. Similar to an occupational license, some certifications can be revoked for a violation of a code of ethics, if applicable, or proven incompetence after due process. Certifications, like other types of credentials, vary significantly among themselves in the breadth and levels of knowledge, skills, and experiences they represent, and in the prerequisites and other requirements that people seeking the credential may need to meet. Some certifications have no prerequisites. Other certifications may require you to have a graduate degree in order to sit for the certification. While some certifications can be obtained as standalone credentials, others are earned as a recognition of specialized skills by workers already possessing a degree, such as nurse practitioners, occupational therapists, architects, and engineers. And in some professions, state occupational licensing requires the licensee to hold a related certification. Degrees are awarded by post-secondary institutions. As most of us know, upon completion of an academic program of study consisting of required experiences, courses, and activities. And degrees do not require renewal. Once you earn your degree, you have that for your lifetime. Licenses, on the other hand, the most distinguishing characteristic of them is that they are issued by government agencies and are awarded for meeting the requirements of an occupation. Similar to certifications, licenses can be revoked and are usually time limited. So let's go to the next slide. Certifications is a term that is widely used in the marketplace, and I'm sure that many of you have heard certifications refer to a number of different things. When someone uses the term certification, therefore, it's really important that you want to ask additional questions to find out which of these elements are they really talking about. So this slide talks about 4 elements that could all be included in a certification. The first is that, does it have a standardized exam? And a standardized exam is based on an extensive scientific job task analysis of the practice area and skill statements. The development of the exam is an intensive process that requires a test and measurement expert to develop a question bank for the exam, and each question or test item is reviewed for bias related to things such as culture, gender, sexual orientation, and geography, and is reviewed in a timely manner to examine how each test item is performing. There's also an ongoing process for how the exams are revised to represent the changing domain knowledge. The second element is recertification, which we just talked about. What does a certification have to do to renew that certification? Does the certification holder have to take continuing education, another assessment, something that shows they can demonstrate and have up-to-date knowledge and skills that potentially enhances the labor market value? The third is that the ability to revoke the certification. Many certifications do include a code of ethics. And finally, whether the certification is accredited by a third party. Similar to higher education, there is an accreditation process for personnel certifications and assessment-based certificates. The 2 main accrediting bodies in the United States are the ANSI National Accreditation Board and the National Commission for Certifying Agencies. Next, certificates, on the other hand, are also equally complex. And there are many types of certificates, as you can see, ranging from certificates of participation, achievement, to assessment-based certificates. The assessment-based certificate is created and awarded by education and training providers. And these certificates at the end have an education or training course or a one-time assessment, which helps demonstrate that the individual has learned the knowledge and skills and the competencies that were in the training course. Assessment-based certificates also require a consensus process involving industry to indicate content. These assessments are also criterion-based and have a continuous quality improvement process. The key of this slide is that assessment-based certificates measure learning outcomes. Certificates of achievement and participation do not. They essentially measure completion or seat time. Next slide. And just a quick slide on WorkCred. WorkCred's mission is to strengthen workforce quality by improving the credentialing system, ensuring its ongoing relevance, and preparing employers, workers, educators, and governments to use it effectively. Our vision is a labor market that relies on relevance, quality, and value of workforce credentials for opportunities, growth, and development. And through research, consulting, and educational activities, we can be a resource for you about workforce development and related issues and help you navigate the complex credentialing system and identify credentials of value. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrea Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, Erin. So just a little about the organization that partnered with WorkCred and UPSIA, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. So we are the oldest higher education member association, and we have over 240 institutions across the US, Canada, and Mexico. We're based in Washington, DC. We're researchers, we're advocates, we're policy folks. Our background really stems around academia and supporting institutions as they become agents of transformation and change. And it is led by President Peter McPherson. Who we serve on the campus is very important. Presidents, VPs, student affairs folks, those whisperers we like to call, the people who do the work on the ground, the boots on the ground that sometimes we don't hear from, but are doing tremendous work. And then what we do is also we advocate, conduct research, organize projects, and our biggest thing is that we convene folks from across different organizations to talk to institutions, so how to help them guide and support them and how they can be and continue to be better agents of their community. Our partner organization, the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities, is a president-led network of 39 institutions across the country, across 25 states, serving over 1 million students. And you can see here a breakdown of the students is that 44% are Pell recipients, 54% of that fit within the racial ethnic minority standards, and 19% of that are adult students, which are considered non-traditional, known as non-traditional students because they are over the age of 25. I will now pass it to Dr. Julia Reynes.
Thank you, Andrea. Friends, I'm here to share a bit about UPSEA, which stands for the University Professional Continuing Education Association. Our members are the leading professionals in post-secondary, professional, continuing, and online education. Our members have a vast and sometimes very distinctive portfolios at predominantly four-year institutions. Most members are responsible for supporting their college or university's online enterprise, or their non-credit operations, or sometimes both. For this reason, our 8 network areas of practice encompass the work typically performed by units, regardless of their actual portfolios. Beyond the community we've built around professional continuing and online education, or PCO for short, we have 2 thought leadership groups focused on non-degree credentials and chief online learning officers at institutions. UPSEA provides resources to members and non-members alike. Our daily news, delivered to your inbox, is curated by a pillar of the higher ed community, Ray Schroeder. Beyond daily news, we have regular blog posts, some of which appear in Inside Higher Ed. We issue policy statements, host events, have professional certificates, and we have a great jobs board. We have hallmarks that serve as aspirational guideposts for leaders in online education, non-credit or professional and continuing ed, as well as alternative credentials or non-degree credentials. Finally, you'll see that we have competency statements for PCO practitioners. If you have a look at those, I know you'll find a lot of applicability in those statements across many of the different roles on our college campuses. I often recommend that folks consider these competency statements when they're writing job descriptions, setting goals for team members, articulating expectations, and creating individual PD plans. And with that, Andrea, I'm going to kick it back to you because I think it's time we actually talk about what we did.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie Reynes. Okay, so a little bit about the project. So other than bringing together some brilliant minds across different organizations, and I'm a big believer in cross-pollination from multiple organizations, WorkCred, APLU, USU, and UPSEA, we explored how our institutions and certification bodies would be able to collaborate to create pathways for learners to earn both a certification and a 4-year degree. The project really focuses on identifying those like growth points, pain points, challenges, anything that could get in the way of a pathway being created between a certification body and an institution. And that was all surfaced at different convenings that we held across the country. So the convenings brought together certification body leaders and a combination of university faculty and leaders and administrators. And it was a mix of presentations, structured discussion, and interactive engagements to ensure that the attendees and participants were able to provide input and feedback as we gathered it all. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the process. The convenings, again, brought together certification body leaders and a wide variety of university leaders and administrators, including faculty and presidents from the institutions, personally nominated institutional representatives who will be able to have conversations with the certification bodies because of their experience, both academic, research, and scholarly, and also the work that they've done, boots on the ground, I like to say. The certification bodies were invited directly by WorkCred, and a mix of presentations and workshops, again, to give the attendees and participants an opportunity to engage in conversations together, but also share with the group what each group found out about their institution and their work, but also what the certification bodies were seeing, hearing after gathering input from the institutions. Pass it back to you, Dr. Uranus.
Sure. So here we have our project timeline. You'll see that we held 4 convenings in person and they were organized by domains. Our April 2019 Washington, D.C. convening focused on healthcare. Our July 2019 convening, we were hosted by San Jose State and we focused on cybersecurity. In October 2019, That convening was hosted by our funder, the Lumina Foundation, and we held that in Indianapolis. And in that convening, we discussed liberal arts education. Our final in-person convening was in December 2019. Georgia Tech hosted our conversation on manufacturing. As with so much in the world, our plans for a March 2020 convening were canceled due to the pandemic. So we elected to round out our project with individual interviews focused on hospitality, just as our convening at FIU would have done. As we shared previously, these convenings brought together universities and certification bodies to discuss how we might reimagine undergraduate curriculum that embeds industry certifications. Now you might be wondering, who attended these convenings? This is the first of 2 slides detailing the institutions represented in the 4 in-person convenings we held. Now, if you're involved in undergraduate curriculum and certifications or other workforce initiatives at these institutions, you might be wondering who attended on behalf of your institution. Because APLU, USU, and UPSIA share many of the same members, we started with that list and then began researching those institutions to determine what they're doing in the certification and non-credit or non-degree credentialing space. Next, my colleagues at APLU and USU's contacted the presidents and provosts at a select number of institutions, and I contacted the senior leaders focused on professional continuing and online education, assuming they would be the point person in some or all of the institution's workforce initiatives and partnerships. By referencing one another's invites and by using 2 different points of contact, we were able to secure commitments and participation from the institutions on these 2 slides. We're very grateful to them for sharing their time and talents in this project. This slide will give you a sense of the certification bodies that were involved in the project. Many of them were featured in the convening programs and the agenda that we had at each one of our convenings, as they were very willing to share the details on the partnerships and collaborations they had with institutions. Their viewpoint was valuable, and we're grateful that they were willing to participate, given the fact that they were seriously outnumbered by institutions. But not only was everyone collegial, but both institutional representatives and certification bodies thanked us for the experiences that they had. Now, as with any project, the challenge in the planning phase is to articulate the expected outcomes and then design opportunities to achieve those outcomes. Here we see the 3 outcomes we planned for in the initial phase of this project. We hope to have a better understanding of the current relationships between universities and certification bodies. We learned early on that there were very few examples of existing relationships. Certification bodies and post-secondary institutions, while important players in workforce development, just simply didn't have relationships or strong ones. Our second expected outcome was stronger relationships and improved dialogue between institutions and certification bodies. Well, if you're starting from 0, there's really no place to go but up, right? So just as I previously mentioned, we had some great conversations. Convening participants thanked us, and we know of a few instances where there were some follow-up conversations and new programs that were being developed that embedded credentials in an undergraduate curriculum. So that was a huge win. Finally, our last expected outcome was a framework that could be piloted, tested, and scaled. We were able to check that box, and my colleague Karen is going to talk a bit more about that. So from our perspective, we actually achieved all of our expected outcomes. We learned a great deal about the state of or relationships between certification bodies and post-secondary institutions, and we have a great deal of information to share. Now I'd like to discuss our takeaways. This is a pretty dense slide. I'm going to discuss these in the order in which the convenings occurred. As with each convening, we learned more, tweaked the agenda, and were able to explore different concepts. First, I'll begin in the upper right-hand portion of the slide with our healthcare convening. This was our first convening, and honestly, we didn't know what we didn't know. We quickly realized that post-secondary institutions and certification bodies simply do not have relationships for the most part. Unless the institution is delivering a credential or content that leads to an industry recognized credential, And that relationship is perhaps supported by a faculty member that holds that credential. Otherwise, higher ed folks, for the most part, are unaware of the rigor of certification programs and curriculum and what goes into setting criteria for sitting for exams and assessments. And they question the premise of certifications. For example, folks asked, why do student internships not count as experience in the field when you need X number of years of experience in the field to sit for the certification exam? Who decides what experience counts? Communication seemed to be a challenge as the certification bodies and post-secondary institutions really didn't speak the same language. Higher ed uses terms like learning outcomes, accreditation, and curriculum, and certification bodies use terms like competencies, job task analyses, and test blueprints. Next up, I'll talk about the cybersecurity convening. One thing I'll mention now is that there were common themes throughout all 4 in-person convenings, but we tried not to be too duplicative in this slide. Meaning we heard similar themes at all convenings, but we're highlighting some of the takeaways that were unique to each convening. So for the cybersecurity convening, as you might expect with any domain that is, it might involve some serious analytical skills, our convening participants asked about return on investment, or ROI, and the value proposition for both certification bodies and institutions, particularly faculty. Further, our convening participants wanted to explore the value proposition for students. So, candidate differentiation, employability, assess skills valued by employers, all bubbled to the top of those conversations. You'll notice that we did duplicate the last comment from both the health and cyber convenings, the idea of concessions. Initially, I think it would be fair to say that both certification bodies and institutions saw one another as immovable forces, but as they talked and shared their perspectives, they became less wedded to their worldviews. Our liberal arts convening was one of the more fascinating convenings, as we had a really interesting mix of participants. Imagine, if you will, a professor of Russian literature discussing embedding certifications in an undergraduate curriculum with someone from a certification body, such as the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters. Both sides, if you will, had a hard time imagining certifications could be embedded in an undergraduate curriculum. That is, unless we're talking about STEM disciplines. Those seemed pretty easy to conceptualize. Languages seem to be another area that might allow for some collaborations. And finally, our last convening focused on manufacturing. And due to the nature of manufacturing and the skills needed for advanced manufacturing, and the fact that many engineering programs exist that wed in some of these concepts, this convening had a great deal of tactical discussions. One stumbling block was the nature of undergraduate degrees and how many credits and courses were allocated to general education that were otherwise untouchable from a manufacturing or engineering faculty perspective. This slide seems to suggest that faculty are unwilling to compromise, but the last bullet really reflects the frustration of all, that undergraduate degrees do not contain room for certifications if that curriculum cannot be woven into existing courses. Many of the courses you find in undergraduate degrees contain other components of learning outcomes required by accreditors, so there's not a lot of latitude to insert new curriculum. I think if I could sum up all of these convenings, it would be to share that there were a lot of light bulbs going off over the heads of participants, and they started thinking creatively about how embedding credentials in undergraduate programs could occur and the benefits for certification bodies, for institutions, and most importantly, for our learners. So not only did we achieve our expected outcomes, but we changed opinions, and that unintended outcome might be the highest and best use of everyone involved. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Karen, who will talk about something I referenced a few minutes ago, the framework we developed during the project.
Thank you, Julie. So as Julie mentioned, the robust conversation that occurred during the convenings really led to the development of the certification degree pathway framework. So what we heard from the certification bodies and the university representatives, we broken down into 6 elements. And I'm going to describe each of these elements and kind of what goes in them. But I also want to say that the whole purpose of developing this framework is to then be able to test the framework at different types of institutions and to make sure that this framework captures everything that needs to be captured, or whether we need to add additional things to this framework to make it more relevant to both the universities and the certification bodies. So I'm going to start in the left-hand side with getting leadership buy-in. So getting leadership buy-in is critical, but it also needs to be obtained from very different levels within the institutions. So when we think about higher education, we're thinking about buy-in not just from the faculty, which is critical, but also from deans, provosts, and presidents. Because what we didn't learn from some of the conversations was that if it's just faculty-led by one faculty who really is passionate about this type of certification, if that faculty member leaves for another institution or retires, there's a chance then that the program might not continue. So we want to really make sure that you get leadership buy-in to build in sustainability. The same is true with certification bodies. It's very important that both the executive director and the director of certification are aware of what these types of certification degree pathways are and are committed to making them work. The second element that Julie mentioned is that the certification bodies in the universities did not speak the same language and did not use the same terminology. And so it's really important that when building these pathways, certification bodies and universities come together to define what the terms are that they are using. And by creating that common language, we're able to facilitate communication and the understanding of the process of embedding certifications into bachelor's degrees. You need to involve in the creation of this common language the higher education, not only the faculty, but also accreditors, the staff at the certification body, as well as those credential consumers, the learners and employers. The third element is the importance of aligning competencies. So what I think everyone at the convenings became very clear about was that those competencies are clearly defined in certifications. You can identify the competencies. In higher education, we tend to more often define learning outcomes. And so it's really important that we think about how those two interact and that we align in several areas. One, we align the competencies that are assessed on the certification exam to the course or the academic program learning outcomes. So we have to do that matching. We also need to think about how the competencies, aligning the competencies with the regional workforce needs. So what are employers in that region saying about the skills and competencies that are required for people to successfully obtain their jobs? And then we need, as we do this alignment, we really need to compare those competencies between the degrees and the certifications and identify where there are gaps. And in some cases, you find that maybe there are no gaps. It may be that the competencies assessed in the certification exam are taught across multiple courses at the higher education institution. In other cases, we may find that there are gaps, and how can those gaps be addressed? What different things need to be added to the curriculum that might not be already included? The fourth element is really determining the appropriate fit in the academic program. That is, where does the certification live within the academic program itself? And there are many options. In some cases, a certification could be used as a capstone to a program, which would be a way to provide third-party validation to the academic content that was taught. It could be that it is offered early because students would have the skills and experiences necessary to sit for the certification exam early in their academic program, or it could be something that's offered after a series of courses if the content is taught over multiple courses. And so that's really important that as these pathways are built, we really identify where is the best place to embed that certification. The fifth element is allocating resources, right? There's no program that doesn't need resources to exist, and we need to be very upfront and honest about that. The first is that there needs to be funding to cover the cost of the certification exam. And we think this is really critical, especially when we talk about equity issues. What we don't want to see happen is that certification degree pathways are built and that only students with certain socioeconomic means are able to pay for the certification course. or certification exam. And we've seen some very interesting ways that people have accomplished building in the cost. So we've seen community colleges, for example, build in the cost of certification exams as part of their cost of tuition and fees. And so that's just one standard cost. And then students could use Pell Grants and other grants and resources to pay for that. We've also seen universities go out and raise money for specific funds that will cover the costs of the certification exam for students. In addition to financial resources, there also need to be resources among staff and faculty to promote the program to students. How do we get new students into the program? How do we get students to be aware of the program? And we also need to identify employers who will value students who graduate with both a degree and a certification. And we need to support students as they pursue the new pathway. And the final element of the framework is, how do we identify how those credentials are going to be communicated? That is, if I earn a certification as part of my four-year degree program, how does anyone know about it? How do we convey and signal to employers and the broader stakeholder community that I have earned this and I have skills? So this could include multiple ways, thinking about how certifications can be incorporated on an academic transcript, the new focus on the development of learning and employment records and how that can be transferred there, as well as offering badges or digital portfolios. So our whole goal of creating this framework was to take the information we gathered from folks and to be able to put it in some type of clear, concise document that can help people start to build these certification degree pathways. And our next goal is then to test these pathways out. I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea Rodriguez to talk about questions for further exploration.
Thank you, Karen. I think with any project, we know that there are going to be further questions if we want to continue to advance the work, and there's going to be opportunity for us to shift, pivot, adapt, and change. And these are just some of the questions that just came up during our time together with the certification bodies and the institutions, but also when we all convened together, the organizations, to talk about what we learned and what we heard from all the participants across the 4 convenings. How can we help faculty and students determine and see the relevance and ROI of certification pathways? What intermediary steps need to exist between the college degree and the certification? We really need a conversation with the accreditors. I love this one because it really touches down on some of the takeaways from the convenience. Like, people need to be able to concede and be able to figure out and acknowledge that there's validation in both a certification and a degree program, but we need to have a conversation with accreditors. There's unclear about where certification bodies and universities convene and connect beyond the workshops. Just given that they learn so much from each other, they wanted to be able to continue to do that and continue to sort of meet and discuss how can we further this work that we're doing and we're learning from each other. Can state governments play a greater role in catalyzing attention of certifications at universities? And finally, how can universities address work experience requirements for sitting for certifications? Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, given everything that's happened in 2020 and how much we all learned as a society, but also more in education, in any space that you sit within education, a lot of what came to the forefront was about equity. Whether the lack of equity work existed in institutions, or there needed to be more nuanced information or questions. We got together as the 3 partnering organizations to figure out what questions through an equity lens are critical and important to continue to advance this work, thinking about the end user, the learner first, and then working ourselves backward from there. So some questions are recognizing the learner's identities, race, socioeconomic status, languages, etc., cross intersections. What factors of a learner's identity can contribute to designing certification and degree C+D pathways? How can universities leverage voices and perspective traditionally not tapped to connect to universities and certification bodies? So really thinking about who are the people on the campuses, who are the whisperers, like I like to say, that are usually not tapped to engage in conversations that are critical to supporting students, especially those from minoritized and historically excluded backgrounds. Next, so what can universities and certification bodies do to ensure that access to C+D pathways are equitable, underrepresented learners, racial, ethnic minority students, low-income students, veterans? How can universities ensure C+D pathways offer faculty guidance and supporting learning outcomes success for underrepresented learners? For example, culturally responsive teaching. We've talked so much about having faculty engage in conversations and being part of these convenings. And yes, we want to make sure that they are part of those conversations, but we also want to make sure, and this is something that Karen touched on, providing resources. It isn't only the financial, the human resources, but it also that support and guidance to make sure that when we are presenting a project or an idea to institutions, certification bodies, that the people have the training in the background to be able to commit to doing that work, especially through an equitable lens. And then finally, what would a C+D pathway outreach process look like through an equity lens? For example, how are we marketing it? Who are we marketing it to? These are just a few of the questions that we're going to continue to research as we explore this continued project. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, here are just some resources. I encourage everyone to take a screenshot, take your iPhone, take your Galaxy, anything you have on, and take a quick screenshot, but we also have this available. Appendices and questions, and we also have the report. Next and final slide. So I, Andrea Rodriguez, as Director of the Office in the Office of Urban Initiatives at APOU USU, thank you alongside my phenomenal colleagues that we continue to do this great work, Dr. Julie Uranus from UPSIA and Karen Elsie from WorkCred. And we know that we will continue to do this work because I think now more than ever, it is extremely critical for students, learners, whether traditional, non-traditional, have the background to be able to signal to employers, I can actually do this. So for questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. If not, please take our emails and we'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for your attending our presentation.